Welcome to the Faith Bible Church podcast. We hope the message you're about to hear is a blessing in your growth in Jesus Christ. We also pray that the message is not a substitute for your critical place in the local church and in community. Thanks again for joining us. The University of Rhode Island did a study years ago. I don't know how, in what department, come up with these incredible sociological and anthropological questions, but the big question of this particular study from the University of Rhode Island was, what is the most dangerous place in America? And this is how they determined, or what they determined, were the most dangerous places in America. Number one was serving in the military in a wartime. That's understandable, okay? Number two was any involvement in some sort of mob violence. And those two are to be expected. The highest rated place after those two was what caught my attention. After those two, which again are kind of to be expected, those are dangerous places by design. What was the most dangerous place in America to be? University of Rhode Island study. You know, anybody? The most dangerous place for an American to be outside of war and mob violence is the home. The home. Because they were studying domestic violence, partner to partner, husband to wife, child abuse. They were studying the idea that most calls that police officers make in many cities are for domestic disturbances. When people are injured, or the police officer is injured, or both. They determined with pretty significant impact that outside of war, can you get this? Outside of war and mob violence, the most dangerous place in America to be is the home. Now, you would expect that study to be done in 2018, 2017. Do you know when it was done? 1978. 1978 was that study. And the reason why I bring it up, even though it's over 40 years old, is the idea that I think that is not better in 2020, but probably worse. And here's the big question. Think about people who grow up in a dangerous home. That may have been you. Hopefully that is not you now, but that may have been your experience growing up. In a home where parents are fighting all the time, maybe physically fighting, maybe there's alcoholism, maybe there's all sorts of other stress, maybe there's abuse of multiple kinds. If you grew up in a home like that, consider the kind of individuals who grow up in an environment like that. That's what they call home. That's supposed to be their safe place. What kind of residue would a person like that take with them when they leave home, when they go into other relationships, when they interact with other people? It has to have an impact, for sure. It has to have an impact on the creation of their families, the next generation and the generation after that. Now, switch it and consider this. What if your home, and hopefully this was your experience, but undoubtedly it wasn't all of your experience, your home was the safe place. It was a place of light and joy. It wasn't perfect. No home is perfect, but it was great. It was good. There was love and grace and freedom and joy. Now, a person who grew up in that home would be completely different, and they take that experience and residue with them in their interactions with others as they create their family in that generation and the next. Here's the big truth. We all take our home with us everywhere we go. We all take our home with us everywhere we go. And the University of Rhode Island over 40 years ago determined that a home is a dangerous place. That's actually in some beautiful way, I hope to describe and explain to you what Jesus wants to talk about today in our text. So we have been in a series called The Life of Jesus Christ, and today we'll be in Matthew chapter 7. So you've got your Bibles. I'd love for you to open to Matthew chapter 7. If you don't, you can open up your phone, pull up your Bible app, do whatever you need. Our Faith Bible Church app has a Bible at the bottom of it. You can open that up and turn to or scroll to Matthew chapter 7, and we will continue our series. Why have we decided to do a series on the life of Jesus during a worldwide pandemic? Well, as I began to pray and talk with some of our elders and pastors, I just thought this was the best thing to do in a time of great challenges, time of constant change, a time of a lot of stress and anxiety. I wanted to focus on the works and the words of Jesus. I just wanted to be near him and to see him as we read these texts, to hear his voice, to walk with him. So the life of Jesus Christ, we started actually before Jesus was born, studying his genealogy. We saw his birth, we saw his childhood, we saw his baptism, his temptation in the wilderness, his calling of disciples, his early miracles, and then very, very recently, we got to Jesus' most famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. And this is our third installment of that, third of three. D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the famous preacher in London over 60 years ago, did a sermon series through the Sermon on the Mount in 30 sermons, okay? We will do it in 3. So take that, Lloyd-Jones. No, I'm just kidding. We won't be able to do the depth that is necessary to do this sermon justice. There's no possible way. In fact, 300 sermons wouldn't do it justice. It is that simply profound. It is that deep and beautiful. And so 3, we are obviously just scratching the surface. We did the Beatitudes. Last week we talked about prayer and fasting and giving. And today we're going to talk a little bit about home in Matthew chapter 7. So Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 1, we're going to read 12 verses together. We'll read it as we typically do, and then we'll go back through it and talk about it and hopefully try to connect the dots, explain it in a way that's very applicational and transformational for us. Does that sound good? Everybody at home, we're okay. All right, Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 1. You'll probably find some of this familiar. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and don't throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be open. Or what man is there among you, when his son asks for a loaf, will he give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father, who is in heaven, give what is good to those who ask him? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. These are the words of Jesus. That's why they're in red. So you should hear his voice behind every one of these statements. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. As I have an inclination, I have a suspicion that there is a little bit of an unseen and invisible battle going on between 2 verses of Scripture when it comes to the population of the world. Okay, I saw a guy yesterday in a big box store. I was doing some home renovation and I needed something, so I went and he walked by and I noticed him. I sort of smiled with my eyes. I had my mask on and he smiled with him and I said, "How you doing?" And he said, "I'm doing good. How are you?" "Good." I noticed him because he had this beautiful black ball cap on and embroidered across the top of it in this beautiful font, John 3:16. And I was like, cool, I like that. All right, how you doing? I'm good. How are you? Great. And we just walked by each other. I'm that kind of guy. I never met a stranger. Okay, and so John 3:16, you see it behind the goalposts at football games, right? Especially college football games. So everybody knows John 3:16. We see that a lot. I wonder how many people worldwide or Americans would be able to quote that verse. I wonder how many would know it in full. Now, here's the flip of that. I wonder how many know this verse. Do not judge, lest you be judged. How many times have people quoted that? They even throw the lest in there because it makes it more formal, right? Don't judge lest you be judged. Now, they know that verse, but they probably don't know the address. It's Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. We just read it. It's Jesus. So I think people know the address, John 3:16, but they know the content of Matthew 7:1 probably more than they know what actually John 3:16 says. It's just a suspicion of mine because I've had so many conversations. I've read too many chat and comment streams that where this verse is quoted, do not judge lest you be judged. Now, here's the big question. What did Jesus mean by that? And how are we to apply it? Let's look. Do not judge so that you will not be judged, for in the same way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Back in the Old English, they used to say it this way. You will be paid back in your own coin. It's another way of saying what we say in America, what comes around goes around, right? So if you toss some judgment out there, be ready to get some judgment in return. And if you don't toss judgment, then you won't be judged. That's what Jesus said. Don't judge lest you be judged, right? But what did he mean? Because Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 and 2 came from the same mouth that John chapter 7, verse 24 came from. Let's look it up on the screen or on your screen. John 7:24, this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Here's Jesus saying there is a wrong way to judge and a right way to judge. You must judge with righteous judgment, not judge by appearance. So that's John 7. Matthew 7, do not judge lest you be judged. What does he mean by it? Well, I think there are two polar opinions on this that are both quite dangerous and false. The first one is we get stuck and mired in the vast amount of opinions and interpretations of this. Well, I just don't know what to do. I judge this? Do I judge that? How do I discriminate? Not between people, but between ideas, truth and false, blah, 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 left or right, black or white. I don't understand. So I'm just going to step back and just kind of, I'm going to file it under question mark. I just don't know how to handle it. That's one option. I think that's dangerous. The other option, more dangerous in my opinion, is I'm not going to say a statement of judgment about anything at any time. I'm not ever going to say what is true or what is false, because to me, that's judgment. And Jesus said, do not judge lest you be judged. So I am going to take a full step back and live in the city called tolerance, where everyone is tolerant, and the only thing we don't tolerate is intolerance, right? That's how we do not judge lest we be judged. I think that is dangerous as well, and not what Jesus meant at all. So what did he mean? Why does he say this and then say something that seems to be different in John 7? Well, it's not different at all, because Jesus is saying the very same thing here. Let's look a little bit more closely. Do not judge, you will be judged. The same way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Then he proceeds to go into what is essentially a very funny story. Jesus has a sense of humor, and this one is supposed to be funny. You're supposed to see it with your mind's eye. And here's the second. This illustration, which has some multifacets, is one of our helps. The second thing is, I think in Jesus' eye, maybe even in the actual context of when he says the sermon, the Pharisees or scribes or teachers of the law, or at least in his mind, maybe even in his sight, in the actual giving of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Pharisees were famous for their judgment. They were literally known for it, and they were proud of it. Now, consider Pharisees. Pharisees, what did they do when they encountered a sinner or a sin? In fact, we have multitudinous stories in the Gospels of Pharisees rushing back from the sin or sinner, separating and isolating themselves for protection and condemning the sinner. Jesus in Luke chapter 7. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus goes to the house of a Pharisee named Simon. Yes, he attended dinner parties at a lot of different kinds of people's houses: prostitutes, tax collectors, Gentiles, Jews, and Pharisees, Simon the Pharisee. And while he's there, he's reclining at the table. They're chatting about what they're going to do on Shabbat or what their mom's favorite dish was. This woman, what the text calls an immoral woman of repute. So like everybody knew her and everybody knew that she was a notorious sinner. She comes crawling in Simon's house. I have no idea how she even got in. And she crawls up to Jesus' feet, which are probably away from the table, as Jews did recline at the table. And she begins to pour very expensive perfume on his feet and weep and wipe his feet with her hair. And Simon the Pharisee on the other side of the table looks at the woman in his own house, right? He's trying not to make a stir. And he says in his mind, if Jesus only knew what kind of woman that was, he wouldn't let her do that. He would be like me, and he would rush back and isolate myself, protect myself from the sinner, and condemn her. Jesus, it says, knowing what Simon said, Simon, when I came, you didn't give me a kiss. You didn't give me any water to wash my feet. This woman has not stopped crying, wetting her feet, my feet with her tears, and kissing my feet. She hasn't stopped. And he didn't say anything. He says, let me tell you a story. There were two debtors, Simon. One of them owed the lender a year and a half worth of wages. The other one owed the lender a little less than 2 months of wages. Neither one of them could pay it back. The lender, out of his mercy, says, you know what? I'm going to forgive and cancel both debts. Which one do you think loved the lender more? Simon says, well, the one he forgave more. He says, you're right. You don't love because you don't think you've been forgiven much. This woman has been forgiven much, so she loves much. You see, Pharisees rushed back from sin and judgment and condemnation. Jesus, with judgment, rushes towards sinners, doesn't he? He rushes towards sinners with redemption, even identifying himself with sinners, not becoming sinful in the process, but taking on our sin. Jesus was known as a drunkard, a wine glutton, and friend of tax collectors and sinners. His reputation was tarnished by the fact that he hung out with dirty, unclean people. That's how he did it. Pharisees rushed back from sin in judgment and condemnation. Jesus, with righteous judgment, rushes towards the sinner. And often he says, go and sin no more when he leaves them. There's a very, very big difference. And so when Jesus says, do not judge lest you be judged, he's not saying don't make a statement of truth or falsehood at all. He's not saying be paralyzed by the difficulty of interpretation. He's saying enter into the right sphere. And here's the story. There was a man with a speck of sawdust in his eye, and there was another man with what's called a log. In the Greek, it is actually a framing beam for a house. So we should see one dude over here with a speck of sawdust in his eye, which I've had before. It's very unpleasant. And another guy with like a 2x6 coming out of his eye. It's supposed to be funny. That's why Jesus told it. He said, you know what's even more funny than the guy with the log trying to get the sawdust out of the other guy is the guy with the log trying to become an optometrist or an ophthalmologist. He said, that wouldn't work, would it? Of course not. Luke's version says, this is where we get the blind leading the blind from. That's not how it works. He says in chapter 6, we saw last week when it comes to prayer, he talked to the Pharisees and Gentiles and he called them hypocrites. He calls me a hypocrite in this passage. He calls you one. Look at verse 5. You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye. Then you will be able to help your brother get the speck out of his eye. There's some judgment in the end of verse 5. We have to judge what the speck is in our brother's eye. He's not saying don't make a judgment about anything. He's saying do it right. And first, never, ever forget how much of God's grace you are in need of. So here's my first statement. It's always about the log. Okay? Can you say that with me? It's always about the log. That's Jesus's point. We must remember how much of God's grace we are in need of. When we do that, when we realize I was a desperately wicked sinner when I found Jesus and when Jesus found me and when I put my faith in Jesus and he redeemed me. If I remember that, when I encounter another desperate, wicked sinner who may be sinning against me, I cannot move towards condemnation and judgment because I must remember it's about the log. It's always about the log. It's always first about the log. Verse 6 of Matthew 7 has a wide history of interpretation and thousands of different options. I'm not going to go into all of that. I think it's a summary statement that has to do with judgment as well. The contrast in the first one is the speck of sawdust with the log. Now it's what's holy and beautiful to be given to what is common and filthy and unclean. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and don't throw your pearls before swine. They will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. I think this is Jesus trying to bring the proper tension back into the conversation about judgment. He says you actually need at times to make a good judgment of things. This is how to perhaps judge when it is right to enter into an opportunity or right to enter into a risk and when it may not be. With your time, with your resources, with all sorts of engagements. This is a difficult text, but I think it's still about judgment. And just as a parting gift in verse 6, you'll never forget it after this, I'm going to teach you a Greek word. Teach you a Greek word that you'll never forget, okay? Mark my words. It's the Greek word for pearl. You want to know what it is? Margarita. How about that? Margaritas is the Greek word for pearl right here. Look it up. I'm not lying to you, okay? Now you'll never forget. Moving on to verse 7, Matthew chapter 7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. Now let me ask you a question. What is the commonality between asking, seeking, and knocking? Asking, seeking, knocking. I spent a long time thinking about this, praying through it. I think it's this, isn't it? Each time, each action, the individual asking or seeking or knocking is admitting that they are in need of something. They're also admitting that they don't have whatever it is going to meet their need. And they're going to a person that they believe can meet their need. And the asking, the seeking, the knocking is actually a request for that person to meet their need. It's a pretty powerful thing. Ask and you will receive. Seek, you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. Now here's what Jesus is setting up. He's going to set up a human-to-human relationship. He's going to compare that to and relate it to our human to divine God relationship. Then I think he means for the comparison to travel back downhill and to inform our human to human relationships. And you know what? It's always about the log. This one, it's always about the asking. It's always about the asking. Because I think this is Jesus' point. Watch. Verse 9, what man is there among you, when his son asks for a loaf, will he give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a snake? No. He says, let's just look at your human relationships. You have an average father. He's not the world's greatest dad, even though he's got the coffee cup. He's probably not. He's not the world's worst dad either. He's just an average guy. He loves his kids, and his kids ask him for something. What is that guy going to do? That guy's going to do whatever he can to give his kids what they ask for within reason, right? Because that's what fathers do. Now, if that's just your average father, Jesus says, what about your perfect, heavenly, omnipotent Father? When you, being a son and daughter, ask him for something, he wants to give you those good gifts, and he can give you those good gifts. So what is the secret? He says, ask. Ask. We ask our Father because we can't manipulate him and we can't control him. So all we do is ask. That's how you engage your heavenly Father when you need something. You can't twist his arm behind his back. It's not a blank check that he writes when he says this, Jesus. You ask the Father. So Jesus says, this is how you interact with God. Let that travel back downhill. What's the best way for you to interact with others around, especially in marriage, in a family, in the community of the church when you need something? Manipulate? Control? Twist their arm? No. Ask. Ask. Seek. Knock. Admit that you don't have it. Admit that you can't provide it for yourself. Go to a person who can and ask them. It's a powerful, powerful relational truth. He compares it to human, then us to the Father, and then it travels back because it's always about the asking. It's not about the getting so much as the asking. And finally, verse 12, and everything therefore. That's a big word in the Sermon on the Mount. Therefore, treat people in the same way you want them to treat you. Rabbi Hillel was a very, very famous Jewish rabbi before the time of Jesus. Much of the Mishnah is written by what Rabbi Hillel would say on a subject, and then another rabbi named Akiva. Rabbi Hillel says this, Rabbi Akiva says that. The legend goes, and it's written down before the time of Jesus, that a Gentile of prominence came to Rabbi Hillel and asked this question. Rabbi Hillel, explain to me the whole of Judaism concisely while standing on one foot, which was a Jewish way of saying, do it in just a few words in a matter of seconds. Explain all of Judaism to me concisely while standing on one foot. Rabbi Hillel says this, do not treat others in a way that you would not want to be treated. This is all of the law. The rest is commentary. Go and do it, he says. This is an ancient idea. It doesn't come from pagan culture. It comes from biblical culture. It comes from God himself. So when Jesus said this, it wasn't revolutionary, but the way that he said it was authoritative because of the way that he exemplified it. That is the difference in what Jesus did. Treat others in the way that you want them to be treated. And then he goes on to say, for this is the law and the prophets. So it's all about the log. It's always about the log. It's always about the asking, and you got it, even though it's terrible grammar, it's always about the treating, not the way people treat you. It's always about the way you treat them. Every one of these ideas, Jesus seems to be focusing on you, on me, on our heart. So here's my big idea. What God has done for you and in you is always the most powerful truth of the moment. Let me explain that to you. What God has done in you is always the most powerful truth of the moment. This is your spiritual home. You were in great need. God provided abundantly for your need in the person of Jesus Christ, in the fullness of his Spirit, in the abundance of his grace, and he met you in that need. And he, if you're a person of faith, if you put your faith in Jesus, and supplied everything that you need. This is your spiritual home. So you always take your home with you. So when you go and interact with someone else, your home will be the most relevant factor in that interaction. So what God has done in you and for you is always the most powerful truth for the moment in this interaction. When I run into an opportunity or a need for judgment, to decide between what is true or false, between what is biblical and right or what is false and wrong, I need to be able to make that judgment without discriminating against people, but to discriminate between the truth and the falsehood, and I need to do it like Jesus did. So what did he do in me? Well, I need to remember how much grace I need. I need to remember how good the Father is. He gives good gifts. And I need to remember how the Father treats me so that I treat other people in the same way. So what God has done in me is always the most powerful truth for the moment. I would encourage you to consider your critical spirit, the way that you may judge in moving towards condemnation. Someone who doesn't look like you, someone who doesn't talk like you, someone who doesn't believe like you, someone who holds different opinions than you. If you hear this from me as a pastor, if you rush away from that person, isolate yourself and condemn them, you look more like a Pharisee than you do look like Jesus. And so do I when I do that. Consider a critical spirit. Consider also a relational humility in the way that you ask of others the things that you need, rather than manipulating and trying to control them. And finally, consider the boldness that Jesus invites you to when you pray to the Father, to ask for good gifts from a good Father who wants to give good gifts to his daughters and to his sons. This is a powerful, powerful idea. Jesus told a parable of prayer that is relevant to this, and he told it in Luke chapter 11, when he talks about the Lord's Prayer there. He says, there was a man who knocked on his neighbor's door in the middle of the night. He says this right after the Lord's Prayer, and he says, hey, I have a guest. I ran out of bread. Would you give me some bread? And the guy got up and he whispers through the door, hey, we're already asleep. Everybody's in bed. Go away. It's the wrong time. We're in the middle of the night. And then Jesus says this, but because of the guy's persistence, that's the way the New American Standard says, because of the guy's persistence, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. And we take that as the guy who's knocking persistence. I'm not going to go away. I'm not going to go away. But that's not what it means at all. The word persistence is actually better translated as shamelessness, his sense of honor. And Jesus isn't talking about the guy who's knocking. Jesus is talking about the guy on the inside. And he says, but because of his sense of honor, he will get up and give him whatever he needs. Because this is a picture, even of a human, imperfect picture. We're supposed to extrapolate that out to perfection to the Father. Because of the Father's love and sense of honor, he moves towards us. He gives and provides for our needs. That's what he does. He's a good Father. Our greatest need, of course, is to overcome the depth and the wages of our sin. And I just can't end our time together without once again explaining to you, to everyone here, to everyone tuning in, that religion, attending religious services, trying to be good, will never earn your way to heaven. Will never, ever get there. And so you must understand, I'm encouraging you, imploring you to understand that Jesus is the way. Jesus provided and perfectly accomplished all that was necessary for God the Father to forgive us, to satisfy his wrath for sin and failure. So when we place our faith in Jesus, his death on the cross and resurrection from the grave, we get his perfection, salvation as a free gift, eternal life. I would encourage you and implore anyone who hasn't yet accepted that free gift from God and put their faith in Jesus to do so now. Let me pray for you.